Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that today's we are running 5 minutes late, but we are trying to get Professor Anna Panu from the University of Bologna here on camera with us because we are using not a software to broadcast to YouTube. For those who are in Brazil, you know that the political moment here, and we have had some people posting stuff on academic events. It happened to us 2, 3 weeks ago, something very unpleasant. So we are now trying to be more careful with that. Who's able to post, especially links on a presentation? We don't want to be disrupted. We have our students here, Ed supporting us with the technology. We have Ana Clara and Learning helping us with the tech and deleting whatever post is pops up in. We have our colleague from the department, Professor Rogério Mendonça. He's also on duty here, very vigilant. And we have Professor Anna Pano. She's greeting us. Good morning, everyone. Anna here. Many thanks. Anna, many thanks for attending this talk. On behalf of the program for Language and Literature Studies in English at the Federal University of Acre and CeSLiC, which is the Center for the Study of Linguistics and Culture from the University of Bologna, we would like to welcome every one of you. And today we have one of the members of CeSLiC. Oh, you say for the Brazilians, we don't say CeSLiC, we say CeSLiC, okay? And today we have one of the members of CeSLiC joining us and sharing a little bit of her experience with research, with linguistics. Our colleague Antonella Luporini. I had the pleasure to meet Antonella a few years ago, and then I had the joy of working with her in Bologna for 2 years. It was an absolutely delightful experience. She teaches SFL in Bologna, and we hope to have other joint events together and work together in the future. Antonella, she did her PhD she got her PhD in linguistics, English linguistics from the University of Pisa in 2013. She has taught courses at undergraduate and graduate levels at the University of Bologna, where she is now, and also the University of Pisa. She's a member of the LILAC in the Department Center for Linguistic Cultural Studies, the CeSLiC, where she's now carrying out research projects on software-assisted literary stylistics and its pedagogic applications. So this is something that we hope Antonella could share with us in the future. I saw a presentation probably early this year looking at literary texts using softwares. So this is a new approach to the study of literature, which can be very sort of insightful for our students who are interested in literature. She's also working on the impact of computer-mediated communication on language, on second language, English teaching and learning, and she's the principal investigator, the PI on a CeSLiC project, COMATS. Her research also focuses on corpus-assisted metaphor studies and critical discourse analysis, with particular reference to the discourse of finance and economics. This is the topic of her PhD dissertation, for which, congratulations, she got an honorable mention at the 2014 AIA Karachi PhD Prize, and of her recent book, Metaphor in Times of Economic Change, published by Arachne in 2019. She has published extensively, and what caught my attention is that she just published this year a paper on the new pandemic, describing the new pandemic, linguistic and communicative studies on the COVID-19 crisis, which is something it's very timely. And this is a topic that we are going to have more and more investigation about. I'm posting here, and at the end of the talk, I will post again her page with the list of publications, so you know You can explore what she has been doing, and feel free to contact Antonella. She's a very, very accessible, generous person, so she will be delighted to exchange ideas with you, send papers if you need. I'm pretty sure she will be happy to do that. Okay, so we are very happy to have you today, Antonella. It's a pleasure to see you again. She has a cold, so she might need to blow her nose every now and then. But I told her, we are all humans. By now, you understand that perfectly after this pandemic. And so, thank you very much, Antonella, for being here. And now the floor is yours to share your ideas with us. Thank you. And then afterwards, we have time for questions, Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for this wonderful introduction. Thanks, really. It was a pleasure to have you here and to work with you as well. And I'm sure we will have other opportunities in the future. Okay, so I'm ready with the presentation. I'm not sure you can see it. Now you can. Thank you very much. All right, so the title of my presentation is Jostling Between Volume and Richness, Methodological and Practical Issues in Corpus-Assisted Meaning Analysis. Francisco, I'm going to say something about the software-assisted literary stylistics, and also I'm also going to mention some research that I've recently carried out on the metaphors describing the pandemic. And maybe then we will have time to discuss this at the end. All right, so basically this talk is going to be a reflection on the advantages, but also the limitations that are inherent in corpus-assisted meaning analysis. That is, when we try and approach semantic and contextual analysis with the aid of software tools. And it's mainly based on my own research experience. So I will also be mentioning and presenting some results, select results from a few case studies. Now, the title of my presentation is basically inspired by this famous quotation. It's taken from Halliday and Matheson's 2014 Introduction to Functional Grammar, in which they say, automatic analysis gets harder the higher up we move along the hierarchy of stratification. It is not able to handle full-fledged systemic functional analysis of clauses, and semantic analysis is also beyond its reach. So we have a trade-off between volume of analysis and richness of analysis. Low-level analysis can be automated to handle large volumes of text, but high-level analysis has to be carried out by hand for small samples of text. Now, this observation reminds me of another claim that was made by Cameron and Dignan in a paper that was published back in 2003, but I guess it's still valid. They say basically the problem when we try and approach meaning analysis with software is that we are trying to trace patterns of meaning, but can only begin our analysis by looking at forms. So we have this clash between form and meaning, form and function. That is really not easy to solve. And then there's also another very famous remark that I would like to share with you at this point. And it's Charles Fillmore's famous assertion that there are two kinds of linguists, basically. One is the corpus linguist, the other one is the so-called armchair linguist. And the corpus linguist says to the armchair linguist, why should I think that what you tell me is true? While the armchair linguist says to the corpus linguist, then why should I think that what you tell me is interesting? So the problem here is basically the corpus linguist asks this question. He asks the armchair linguist, why should I believe in what you're saying? Because obviously traditional armchair linguistics basically relies on intuition, which is not always reliable, as we know very well. So the traditional armchair linguist works on what he or she knows intuitively about language without providing any kind of evidence. On the other hand, the armchair linguist replies, why should I think that what you tell me is interesting? Because the problem there is that statistical significance, or perhaps better, statistical measures, quantitative data, which is typically the kind of information that we get from corpus tools, is not in and of itself guarantee of significance. So we have this kind of clash again between these two kinds of linguists that is more and more visible nowadays. So on this basis, in today's talk, we are going to consider specifically two kinds of, two fields, two areas of semantic analysis, two areas of analysis having to do with meanings. And those are obviously the fields I am working on in my own research. And one is metaphor studies. The other one is verbal art, which is Rakaya Hassan's expression referring to literature. Okay? So she calls it verbal art. And so the observations, the claims I will be making in the talk refer to three research stages, which are obviously data collection, then another very important step, which is the moment when you have to choose a methodology for your studies, for your research, and then analysis proper. Which is the third and last research stage we are going to talk about. Okay, so let's start with the first part of the talk, which is dedicated to metaphor. It is about metaphor. And let me begin with sorry, there's a problem with the animation here, spoiler. So let me begin with a definition of metaphor, first of all. Now, the most comprehensive, I would say, definition of metaphor is based on the etymology of the word itself. So the word metaphor comes from a Greek verb, metaphero, which means to carry over. So metaphor is a transfer of meaning that is carried over from the linguistic, lexicogrammatical element that is most naturally associated with it to a different one on the basis of some shared property between the two. And why am I looking for a comprehensive definition of metaphor? Because actually we can say that there are two types of metaphor. One is very well known. The other one is perhaps less known, but equally, and less studied, but equally important. These two types are lexical and grammatical metaphor. In lexical metaphor, we have a transfer of meaning, which is mainly realized by lexical words, as in the famous example, my lawyer is a shark. So here you have a transfer of meaning. There is a nominal group here, a shark. This is used to qualify the lawyer, to express some of the lawyer's basic main characteristics. And it's obviously a metaphorical use because the lawyer is not literally a shark. The lawyer has something in common with a shark: aggressiveness, ruthlessness, and so on and so forth. The second type of metaphor, grammatical metaphor, here the transfer involves lexicogrammatical structures. Okay, so not just lexical words or expressions, but whole grammatical structures, as in the reading of the book, So basically here you have this noun, this nominal group, the reading, which stands for an action, a process. Okay, so someone read the book. So lexical metaphor is widely studied nowadays, especially within cognitive linguistics, and especially after the inception of conceptual metaphor theory, which took off with the publication of Lakoff and Johnson's famous book Metaphors We Live By back in 1980. Grammatical metaphor is mainly developed and studied within systemic functional linguistics. And what is interesting about these two types is that they have a common ground. Okay, so they both realize, even if with differences, with structural differences, but they still realize the same kind of general principle, which is this transfer of meaning. And Miriam Taverniers, who has worked a lot on the relationship between lexical and grammatical metaphor, notes that both these kinds of metaphor result in what she calls a semantic tension. Okay, so this takes us back to the definition of high-level studies that we were talking about at the beginning. So we are talking about research addressing semantics, okay, not just lexis and grammar, but also semantics and context. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on nominalization in particular, which is a particular type of grammatical metaphor, as in the reading of the book, not only because it's the main topic of my research, but also because it's the most widely studied kind of grammatical metaphor. Okay, now having defined what metaphor is, let us first of all ask ourselves this question, which is fundamental at this point. Which corpus or which corpora should we use to study metaphor? Recalling that we are talking about corpus-assisted meaning analysis. So we want to be able to somehow use corpora to assist us in this kind of study. Now, obviously, there is no straightforward answer to this question, and the answer will mainly depend on our research questions. Okay? But we can at least try and summarize some of the advantages and limitations of different kinds of corpora. So on the one hand, we have ready-made corpora, which are collections of text that are already available. Okay, they were created by researchers, etc., and that's why we call them ready-made. They are available for further research, typically online. Now, on the one hand, obviously, ready-made corpora have advantages. They are time-saving because they are ready, so you don't have to go looking for texts to create your own corpus of texts. Typically, they also are very large in size, which means that they have a wide coverage of texts and registers, and this obviously guarantees a robust quantitative analysis because you have many data. And third, as it usually happens, they include different kinds of text, different text types, different registers. These are usually already balanced, the various kinds, which obviously is important to guarantee statistical significance to your results. At the same time, there are cons, so there are pros and cons. The problems here is that ready-made corpora are general interest corpora, so they are not tailored to our research questions. They may require subscription. In case they're not free, you have to subscribe, and so pay for a subscription. Typically, ready-made corpora each ready-made corpus comes with its own corpus query system, with its own piece of software. So the query functions and the interface may differ. And last but not least, what if you want to work on different languages? What if you want to compare, for instance, the metaphors for a given topic in Portuguese and English, or in Italian and English? You don't have the same ready-made corpus usually at least for the 2 or more languages you want to work with. So the alternative is build your own corpus, which is what we call an ad hoc corpus. Ad hoc corpora are tailored to our research questions. Another advantage is that as you're working with your own ad hoc corpus, you can annotate it, and then the annotated corpus can be made available to the community, which is very important. This is something I think we truly need nowadays. We need more and more annotated data to help us in our research. And of course, an ad hoc corpus is also versatile because you can update it as your research unfolds. You can add more texts and so on and so forth. And yet, obviously, once again, we have the negative side, okay, the other side of the coin, which is that obviously these are more time consuming because you have to go looking for texts. You have to prepare texts for the corpus. Usually texts need cleaning, etc. There may be some sort of inbuilt bias in the sense that, it could be argued that your research questions, the research questions that you have at the beginning of your research may somehow, even if unconsciously perhaps, influence your choice of texts. And then last but not least, there may be copyright issues depending on the kind of texts you are working on. Okay, now, so this is the first kind of problem we have to face when we approach meaning analysis, high-level analysis, as Halliday and Matheson call it, through corpora. Okay, so which corpus or corpora, and obviously the choice of the corpus will affect your results, so it's fundamental. So we move on at this point. Suppose we have found our corpus, so we know what kind of textual material, what kind of textual data we'll be working with. At this point, if we are working on metaphors, we want to be able to find the metaphors in our corpora. So is it possible to find metaphors automatically? Is it possible to rely completely on software programs, on algorithms? Now, in the case of lexical metaphors, steady advances were made in the last years in terms of natural language processing, precisely with a view to identifying metaphors automatically in text. But again, there's a but here. First of all, when you're using supervised algorithms, there is a need for extensive preliminary annotation to train them. Okay, so human intervention, heavy human intervention is needed here. So far, the studies, the research projects, so researchers working on trying to find algorithms that can automatically identify with a great deal of accuracy metaphors in text, their studies have focused on a limited set of typically nominal structures, which is not enough because actually lexical metaphor is a wide field. The lexical metaphor is very complex. It can affect different parts of speech, not just nouns, but also verbs, even prepositions. And that obviously makes things much more challenging. Then, what else? Polysemous words are still problematic. Words having different meanings depending on the context and on the co-text are still problematic. There are difficulties in capturing highly conventional metaphors. the algorithm might actually overlook them, while highly conventional metaphors can be interesting for our research. Okay, precisely because being highly conventional, they tend to go unnoticed, but they still have effects, on the kind of representation of a given topic or event they provide, and so on the readers or on the reader's response in general, okay, readers or hearers' response. And obviously, these algorithms are mainly developed for or tested on English, which again is a problem if and when you want to carry out a contrastive analysis. Okay, so comparing English with another language. As for grammatical metaphors, natural language processing applications are very scarce and generally small scale. I have put an example here. It's a research paper in which the authors present a tool to automatically identify metaphors in text that's called Denom. It's very interesting, actually. The problem is that it works on a highly specific text type, which is engineering requirements and specifications. These are documents specifying all the requirements for a product as a preliminary step in the development and production process. So this tool that was developed by the authors of this paper does actually focus on this very specific text type. And again, obviously, it's tested and developed for and tested on languages other than Italian, for instance. Okay, so let's now go to, so basically with wholly, totally automatic identification, there is a high risk of overlooking patterns. And obviously, we want to avoid that. At present, the risk is too high. Okay, it remains too high. So let's now go to semi-automatic identification at this point. And by semi-automatic identification, I mean corpus-assisted analysis. Okay, so a combination of corpus tools on the one hand and armchair manual analysis on the other. How to look for lexical metaphors with the aid of corpus tools, for instance. Now, in this research project on metaphor in economic change, metaphor in times of economic change, which basically started off with my PhD research project, I analyzed the metaphorical representation of the 2008 financial crisis and of the notion of cryptocurrency in different ad hoc specifically built corpora by working on two lemmas, crisis and cryptocurrency. So basically, I had my own ad hoc corpora. I looked for the occurrences of these two lemmas, crisis and cryptocurrency, in the corpora. I retrieved the so-called keyword in context concordances. So I looked for the various occurrences of these items, of these lexical items in their original context. And then I started working on the concordance lines basically by hand. Okay, so there was this combination of corpus tools. The corpus helped me retrieve the occurrences, and then at some point I had to move to the armchair and I had to start looking for metaphors in the concordance lines manually. Now, what is the problem with this kind of approach? That there is a risk of missing relevant patterns. For instance, those metaphorical expressions in which the two concepts are left implicit will not be retrieved by the corpus tool. And so you have to accept this risk, obviously, if you are working with a corpus query system, if you are working with a computer. So suppose, for instance, a writer, okay, the author of one of the texts in my corpus says, we have fallen in this huge trap and we don't know how to get out of it, referring implicitly to the crisis. the corpus tool would not be able, obviously, to find this expression, this metaphorical expression, because the author here, the text maker, is talking about the crisis in terms of a trap. The corpus tool wouldn't be able to find this instantiation because obviously the term, the noun crisis is not explicit in the lexicogrammatical structure. And now going to grammatical metaphor and nominalization in particular, which is the focus, as I said at the beginning here. How can we look for grammatical metaphors with the aid of corpus tools? Now, in grammatical metaphor, variation is lexicogrammatical rather than simply lexical. So the grammatical side would seem to lend itself more readily to identification with corpus tools. Think about nominalization through suffixation. Okay, you can look for the specific suffix in a corpus. It's a grammatical marker, okay, the suffix, nominalization, or suffixation. These are examples of nominalization themselves. So you can look for this suffix shown in the corpus and retrieve all the different occurrences. So you see, this kind of metaphor seems to be easier in a way to identify using corpus tools. And yet, again, there are buts. First of all, the quality of your results will depend to a great extent on the parser or the tagger that you're using. The parser is a piece of software that automatically chunks your text into smaller units, into sentences. Sentences then are broken down into phrases, groups and phrases, and then words, etc. The tagger is software that automatically assigns a part of speech tag, noun, verb, etc., to the items making up your text, so the texts in your corpus. So obviously the quality of results depend on the parser and the tagger that you're using. Then what else? The list of grammatical markers to look for may be non-exhaustive. In English, there are different suffixes that can be used to create nominalizations. Some of them are more frequent. Some other grammatical markers, some other suffixes are less frequent. So your list may be non-exhaustive, which obviously means that if the list is non-exhaustive, then you're going to miss patterns. And then some instantiations simply, you see, defy the quest for a grammatical marker. Think about analysis, which is a historical nominalization. Analysis is a noun. It comes from a Greek noun, a noun in ancient Greek, which was a nominalization from the verb analuo. That's why I call it a historical nominalization. So there is no grammatical marker here in this case. Analysis is a noun in English, and yet we can consider it a nominalization. And then there are also nouns indicating processes that do not have an agnate verb, as Banks notes in a paper published in 2003. Okay, so again, there is a risk. There is this inbuilt risk of finding many interesting things, okay, but losing something else. So, manual identification now. Okay, what happens if you opt for the armchair? Okay, if you decide to look for metaphors manually. Well, the problem at this point, the question arises as to what one should consider as a metaphor. Okay, so what counts as metaphor? So think about these two examples here. One, hold steady amid epidemic. This is taken from China Daily, which is a newspaper published in English in China. And it's a headline from the February 6th, 2020 issue. So is this a lexical metaphor? Amid epidemic, yes or no? Amid, this preposition here, the problem you see here is that there is a clash between the preposition, which literally is used to refer to concrete substances, and the noun epidemic, which is abstract. So could we say that the expression amid epidemic metaphorically represents the epidemic as something substantial, as a liquid, perhaps a liquid substance surrounding us? Yes or no? It depends. It depends on what you decide to consider as metaphorical at the beginning of your research. And what about this other example, which is taken from the web? Okay, it's a nice quotation taken from the web. Die with memories, not dreams. What about these memories? Is it a nominalization? There is no agnate verb form here. The word memory comes from French mémoire, and this in turn comes from Latin memoria. So is it a noun standing for a process? Well, memories seem to be more like the frozen output, the result of the process of the action of remembering. And in fact, there are nominalizations like recollection, remembrance, which could be used here in place of memories. So is this a nominalization? Now, I'm pretty sure that if I asked all of you to tell me what your answer is, we will never reach 100% agreement. Or actually, perhaps if you want, you can tell me what your opinion is using the chat, and we can look at it later. So there is the risk of bias, inconsistency, especially when you work with many data, of choosing too rigid criteria, or conversely, of seeing metaphors everywhere if you are too flexible. So this calls for the need to adopt and possibly also adapt or devise ad hoc and follow a rigorous identification procedure, which you must choose at the beginning of your work. And obviously, in an ideal world, research projects having to do with metaphors, grammatical and lexical, should involve several different annotators and provide inter-rater reliability measures, precisely because there is a decline, as is to be expected when one is working with language. Things are fuzzy, right? So there is a decline. The two extremes are, there are examples, instantiations of metaphors that are clear-cut, and then there are other examples, other instantiations that are kind of indeterminate, ambiguous. Okay, so it's not always easy to decide. Okay, now, at this point, even if we were living in an imaginary world in which computers are capable of retrieving all the instances of grammatical and lexical metaphor in a text with 100% accuracy, well, this would leave us with a wealth of mainly quantitative data, which is very interesting, of course, but is probably not enough per se. And why? Because we want to be able to say something more about metaphor. Okay? And in fact, I think metaphor studies truly exploit their potential within the framework of critical discourse analysis. So from this perspective, the aspects we focus on are the ideological and representational power of metaphor. So metaphor as a framing strategy, metaphor as a tool, as something that can be used to frame things, concepts, events, positively or negatively. Okay, so here you have two examples having to do with the metaphorical representation of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic. First one comes from a very interesting study by Marco Bagli, who works on the metaphorical representation of heroes, so people as heroes, medical staff, but also citizens as heroes in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This comes from his corpus. Frontline healthcare workers have been the unsung heroes of the novel coronavirus pandemic. And this comes from, again, from China Daily. This was an ad hoc corpus I built for my own study. So it's another headline from this Chinese newspaper: US spreading fear over outbreak. So the first one, the first example realizes pandemic is war, obviously. It's a lexical metaphor. In the second example, you have two nominalizations, grammatical metaphor: fear and outbreak. So there are actions and views that are sanctioned by metaphor. For instance, war metaphors are divisive. They focus on conflict instead of solidarity. And well, in fact, perhaps if we have time later, we'll talk about it. There was an initiative that was launched by a group of linguists that's called Reframe COVID. So they're trying to look for alternative ways of metaphorically representing the pandemic, because, you know, with war metaphors have implications that are kind of problematic. Nominalizations are also important from an ideological representational perspective, because a nominalization tends to present events as things. Okay, so nominalizations typically make actions, events, meanings in general non-negotiable. Okay, it's very, very difficult to argue against a nominalization that presents something as a fact. Consider the second example here: US is spreading fear over outbreak. Okay. So nominalizations in turn realize presuppositions and compress meanings, making them non-negotiable. So these two aspects make these two kinds of metaphor very interesting from the viewpoint of critical discourse analysis. And there are also patterns of synergy between the two as framing devices, something I've been working on for, you know, quite a few years now. And this is all material for armchair scrutiny. This is something that you cannot really find with computer software, okay? Because artificial intelligence at present is very good at classifying, of course, but not at understanding, at least not yet. And in fact, in a recent paper, I've made a proposal to combine metaphor and appraisal analysis to assess framing in a more systematic way. And this is the paper Francisco was talking about before. In this paper, I investigated the representation of the spread of coronavirus and actions taken against it in a corpus of headlines from China Daily and the Wall Street Journal, published between January and February 2020. Here you have two examples of war metaphors. I'm not going into that. I'm not discussing them for reasons of time, but basically what I wanted to show you is that the same kind of metaphorical representation, war metaphor, can be used to provide a positive or a negative framing depending on the context, depending on who is using the metaphor, for what reasons, when, and so on and so forth. So once again, a comfortable armchair is needed. And in fact, the corpus I built for this study was very small. Okay, it was about 4,500 words, which is a small corpus. And I mainly worked on this by hand. Now I move to the second part of my talk. I may be late. Francisco, tell me if I should hurry up. I'm sorry. So the second part of this. Okay.
Engaged with your presentation.
I can't hear you, Francisco. Can you repeat? Sorry.
Sorry. So I'm just saying that you can go on. Don't worry. I think people are very sort of interested in the topic. So please go on.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. So in the second part now, we are going to talk about verbal art. We're going to talk about, we are changing topic and we move from metaphor studies to the software-assisted analysis of literature texts. And so in the second part, I'm going to refer to research that I'm carrying out with my colleague Donna Miller, within the CeSLiC project SSS, the corpus, and the consumer. And I'm going to talk about several papers, research studies. Research that I carried out with my colleague as part of this, Donna Miller, as part of this research project. And here you have the link to the page, to the web page dedicated to the research project, where you can find more information about it. Okay, so what is systemic? So SSS, you see here in the title of the project, SSS, the corpus and the consumer. SSS stands for, this acronym stands for Systemic Sociosemantic Stylistics, which is a particular approach to stylistics. It's a model for the study of the language in literature, which is rooted in systemic functional linguistics, and that was developed by Rakaya Hassan. The expression language in literature here is emphasized because it's Rakaya Hassan's own expression. So she observes that we should be talking about language in literature instead of language, the language of literature. So here, here you have a representation, a schematic representation of the model proposed by Rakaya Hassan, which is as we call it, a double articulation model. So it's double articulation because, as you can see, there are, according to Hassan, there are two systems of semiosis, two semiotic systems that are involved, okay, that are working in literature, in verbal art, as she calls it. One is the semiotic system of language, which is, you know, the semiotic system characterizing any kind of text. But literature is special. Literature is a special register because actually there is here we find a second level of semiosis, what she calls the semiotic system of verbal art. And the art of verbal art is to be found precisely in the second order. Okay? Verbalization, symbolic articulation, and theme. And especially the art of verbal art is to be found in the level of symbolic articulation, which, as Miller says, is, this is a very nice definition, symbolic articulation is the grammar of the text's deepest meanings, its theme. And so, in Hassan's view, symbolic articulation is a question of Mukarovsky's foregrounding, or, as Miller demonstrates in her research, of Jacobson's pervasive parallelism. Foregrounding, Hassan calls it the patterning of patterns that we can find in a literature text. So we have patterns of significant contrast against what the text establishes as a norm. Significant contrast for Hassan is contrast that is consistent throughout the text and motivated. So if we want to, when as researchers we work on the literature text, we want to be able to identify foregrounding, because foregrounding is the key to get to the text's deepest meanings, which is what Hassan calls the text's theme. So the question at this point becomes, and this is the main research question, one of the main research questions in our CeSLiC research project: how doable is corpus-assisted systemic sociosemantic stylistics? Because obviously, as you can see, this qualifies as high-level analysis par excellence. High level because it addresses semantics. Probing foregrounding and pervasive parallelism is a question of working at the level of semantics. It requires us to work with ideational, interpersonal, and textual meanings at the semiotic system of language, and then to confront ourselves with the second order of semiosis to unveil the foregrounding mechanisms. There are two orders of semiosis, again, to consider. So how is it possible to make this wholly, fully automatic. And at the same time, this is high-level analysis par excellence because it also addresses not just semantics again, but also the context. And be careful, because the text-context relationship in verbal art is more complex than in any other register. And why? Because there are different contexts here to be taken into account if you think about it. There is the fictional context, the context that is created by the text, and then there is a context of creation, the writers, artistic conventions, language, etc., and the context of reception of the reader, and all of them impact on the analysis. Okay, so how doable is this kind of analysis with corpus tools, with computer programs? We'll try to answer this question, but first of all, let's again go back to this fundamental question, which comes again. Okay, it presents itself every time we decide to use corpora to study language. So, which corpus or corpora should we use in a systemic sociosemantic stylistics analysis? An ad hoc corpus or a ready-made corpus? Now, if we opt for an ad hoc corpus, it means that we want to treat the literary text as corpus. So I can choose a literary text, one that I want to study in depth. I can find its electronic version. Okay, I can find it in electronic format, and then I can use corpus tools, corpus software to query the text. Okay, so to automatically retrieve patterns. Problems. The availability of the text I'm choosing, or a collection of texts in electronic format for corpus construction. This is, not guaranteed. Sometimes you find them, sometimes you don't. So what if the text you want to work on is not available in electronic format? Second problem, typically this kind of text needs cleaning, and this is a time-consuming activity. You have to read the text in electronic format and clean it, because otherwise, if it has problems, even just small typos, they can affect results. And then there are copyright issues, especially if you want to work with contemporary literature. This is very problematic from this viewpoint, because texts are obviously covered by copyright, but even the classics. Project Gutenberg, this huge database, which is a very good friend, okay, for people working with corpus-assisted stylistics. Project Gutenberg was blocked in Italy back in May 2020 for copyright problems. So, it's not easy. What about a ready-made corpus? Well, it must include literature or fiction, such as the British National Corpus. The British National Corpus has a section on literature and fiction, so you could use it to study the language in literature. But obviously, again, a ready-made corpus is not necessarily tailored to one research needs. It may be used as a reference corpus for your studies, but not as your focus corpus. A notable exception is the corpus of the canon of Western literature, which is presented and described in a paper published in Language and Literature. The author is Clarence Green, 2017, which is an open source and freely available corpus. And it's based on Harold Bloom's definition of the Western canon. It includes different texts from different from different epochs, different times. Okay, so let's now talk about foregrounding and corpus. So is it possible to research foregrounding using corpora? So I can now tell you something about these two studies, which are corpus-assisted SSS studies on post-colonial rewritings of canonical texts. One is a study I carried out with Donna Miller on Coetzee's Faux, which is a rewriting of Robinson Crusoe, and the other one is a study of a corpus-assisted study of White Sargasso Sea, which is a rewriting of Jane Eyre that I carried out myself. So as far as methodology is concerned, these studies apply the tools of corpus linguistics to the analysis of these texts, obviously in electronic formats. So Faux and White Sargasso Sea are used as corpora, okay, here. So these studies, both these studies began by considering first the most frequent lemmas in the two texts through a lemmatized word list, which is one of the tools that are available using corpus query systems such as AntConc or Sketch Engine. So these are words or lemmas in this case that are particularly frequent in the texts. And then the studies moved on to consider the so-called keywords. Keywords are words or lemmas that are significantly frequent in a corpus in comparison to a reference corpus. And since both studies focus on rewritings of canonical texts, the canonical texts were used as reference corpora to retrieve keywords. Okay, so we looked for lexical items, lexicogrammatical items, let's say, that were particularly frequent in the rewritings compared with their canonical texts. So this approach allowed us to spotlight certain lexical items that were potentially significant. Okay? They were quantitatively prominent and so potentially worth further investigation. And these were the lemmas truth, true, and truly in Faux and white and red in White Sargasso Sea. So these were then analyzed through concordances, showing them in their original context. And at this point, these studies became corpus-assisted SSS appraisal studies because we decided to focus specifically on the appraisal patterns involving these words, well, these lemmas. As this analytical perspective seemed to be relevant, promising in terms of symbolic articulation. So, you know, again, appraisal makes things even more complicated because you have to start working with co-text and logogenesis, the way the text unfolds. Appraisal presents its own challenges because, you know, different appraisal, for those of you who are familiar with appraisal systems, with the appraisal framework will know that, you know, in appraisal, you have different categories that tend to overlap, what Thompson calls Russian dolls. And then, you know, appraisal works in a text in a cumulative fashion. So you have to look for logogenesis, the concordance line, showing your search term in its co-text with a few words before it and a few words after it is usually not enough. You have to go beyond it. So again, sinking into the armchair, moving back and forth from the computer to the armchair. So yeah, it was I won't go in detail into the findings as this obviously goes beyond the scope of this presentation, but let me tell you that it was basically through manual analysis at this point that we found that the evaluation patterns involving these lexical items, info and White Sargasso Sea, can be said to work as foregrounding, to be foregrounded. And so they can be said to work to build up the text's themes. The theme info is linked to the complex, ambiguous, and precarious connection between silence and words, the power of both silence and words to shape history and veracity. While in White Sargasso Sea, the theme was formulated as the conflicts inherent in cross-cultural encounter as a cause of suffering, alienation, and ultimately insanity. And this is something we found through manual analysis of the appraisal patterns in the concordance lines retrieved from the texts, from the corpora. So, And it is also important to say that manual analysis, in order to arrive at the theme, also involved reconsidering the findings in the light of the context of creation of this text. So again, working at the level of semantics and context. So counting patterns is an important starting point when you're working with SSS, when you're working with this kind of stylistic analysis of literature. And obviously the corpus can help us quantify for grounding. So the corpus tools give us quantitative data, quantitative evidence that is important as a starting point. Relying on intuition only, as usual, would be misleading or even impossible, especially when you're working with long texts. So the corpus tools can help us, but they cannot actually supplant manual scrutiny. So you need both. I'm concluding here. So in conclusion, I would like to say just a couple of words on what I call the paradox of corpus-assisted meaning analysis in the big data era. For certain types of text, it is possible and even easy to collect very large amounts of linguistic data. Think about the technique called web scraping, tweets that can be collected automatically via the Twitter API. You have a link here, www.englishcorpora.org. Here you find different kinds of corpora, even huge corpora that are created using, different techniques, among which web scraping. There's also a corpus that's called the coronavirus corpus that is constantly updated and includes texts from different sources having to do with coronavirus. So for certain types of text, it is possible and easy to collect large amounts of linguistic data. This basically gives us huge data sets that require too much time and workforce to be fully analyzed from a qualitative viewpoint. So you get huge data sets that no one will ever fully qualitatively analyze completely, okay? Because you will just need too much time, and probably big data are too fast for us. So this leads us to a quantitative turn in analysis. So there are wide-ranging studies using this kind of huge data sets are necessarily quantitative. They focus on quantitative data because that's what you can get automatically. Qualitative studies will necessarily focus on smaller subsets of data. Okay? And at the same time, there are other text types, such as literature, which remain the Cinderella of corpus construction for the reasons we talked about before. Okay? So I would like to, spend a few words in defense of small corpora and even small aid of corpora. Because, the problem with small corpora is that with a small set of data, you cannot easily make generalizations. But small corpora are very important because they allow us to work qualitatively, from a qualitative viewpoint, to go in depth, to move from the computer to the armchair. And that's important, okay? And you can combine results from different studies on small corpora and slowly, gradually get to, meaningful generalizations. So now, to really concluding, the corpus to me remains what I call a magnifying glass. It is very useful. It can help us spotlight, notice things. It is fundamental to avoid intuition, which is unreliable, but it is not enough. Okay, so you need both the corpus as a magnifying glass and the researcher's manual scrutiny. At the same time, we should also remember that linguists should not be afraid of artificial intelligence. It is important actually to have a combination of different approaches. As Franzosi notes, at least some of the NLP tools of automatic textual analysis and the data analytics visualization tools can be applied not just to big data, but to small data as well. Humanists and social scientists need not fear computer scientists. Rather, they need to learn to take advantage of them. This is, I think, a very clever observation. As for the corpus and armchair combination binomial, the two kinds of linguist Fillmore goes on. Remember the quote from Fillmore we saw at the beginning? Well, from there, he goes on saying the two kinds of linguists, wherever possible, should exist in the same body. And I totally agree with Fillmore. And in fact, at this point, I would like to show you a picture of my workstation, which, as you can see, helps me save time in shifting between these two modes, the armchair and the computer. I've got them together, okay? And so I can work on the computer while I'm sitting comfortably in my armchair. Okay, that's it, I would say. So thanks a lot. Here is my contact, and here are the references in case you're interested and want to know more about what I've been saying so far. Thanks. The mic, Francisco. The microphone.
Oh yeah, the mic. Thank you, Antonella. That was quite bright, with a lot of information, but very, very enlightening. And I hope people get inspired by your talk to explore more corpus linguistics and the study of metaphors. It's just it's a very sort of rich field because we never stop inventing them, transforming them. So we have some time. We have time for questions. We have already a few questions. One of them actually you answered to Jason, but if you want, you can come back to it and elaborate so other people pick up Jas's question more specifically, and you can elaborate more specifically, of course. So questions. The first one is from Juan Lima de Paula. Thank you, Juan. I think that in English, the line of ambiguity is very thin, so I wanted to know if the best way would always be to analyze the metaphors in the context.
I would need to know what Juan means by the line of ambiguity. What do you mean exactly? I'm not sure, Francisco.
Yeah, I was actually a little bit sort of in doubt because I think ambiguity is something that exists in all languages and it depends on the context. But maybe you can address this issue of context, sort of analyzing metaphors in context.
Well, yeah, so I guess, so perhaps if you want to, he can tell us something more about what he means by the line of ambiguity. I'm sorry, because, taken out of context, the question is a bit difficult to process. So what I can say, broadly speaking, is that I believe it is, it is fundamental to take into account the context. You can't do without the context, and that's also one of the main points, one of the tenets of systemic functional linguistics. So yeah, my answer would be, yeah, it is fundamental to always take the context into account. You saw the two examples I mentioned before, word metaphors. The one having enacting a positive framing and the other one enacting a negative framing. It's the same kind of metaphor based on the domain of war, but it is the context that makes the difference between a positive and a negative framing, and that is something you can assess only by only through armchair manual scrutiny. So I guess my answer is yes, it is always fundamental to consider the meanings, semantics, with conceptual metaphor theory, it is also fundamental to consider the conceptual structure, so even going beyond that and the context.
Okay, well, I hope it answers your question. Next, Alexandra, could you please elaborate on the process of cleaning in the case of adult corpus?
Oh, yes, of course. By cleaning, I mean that, first of all, usually you need to, with nowadays, actually, with the corpus query systems that we have nowadays, one of which is Sketch Engine, which is a very powerful corpus tool. You can actually upload different kinds of texts. So, I mean, different, formats, PDF, TXT, Word documents, so it's not a problem. But if you're using a different kind of corpus query system, you may be required to actually save your text in a specific format. And that's one thing. The other thing, by cleaning, I mean that typically, if suppose, for instance, you decide to download a text from Project Gutenberg, okay, a literary text, and to work on it using the approach I talked about before. Typically, the text you get will contain typos, errors, mistakes that can affect your results. So usually it is necessary to read the text at least once to make sure you get rid of all the possible inaccuracies, typos, errors, etc. Because otherwise, they create noise, as we call it, in your results. So it is important to make sure that your corpus is in perfect shape. Let me put it that way.
Thank you, Antonella. Thank you. Next question.
Yeah.
I think it's one from Jess. Jess, we're just going back to it. So hold on.
Donna, thanks.
Donna Miller. Just for the audience, Professor Donna Miller, is an honor to have her here today. I think she was the founder of CeSLiC, and she has been a driving force behind systemic functional linguistics. She has inspired and trained many students. So thank you for being here, Professor Donna Miller. So, lovely Antonella, if there's time, can you say more about that hashtag Reframe COVID initiative? Seems rather difficult to explore. I think explore such a conventional framing.
Yeah, thanks for being here, really. Thanks a lot. So Professor Miller, as I said, is also she's working with me. She's actually the principal investigator of this CeSLiC research project that we have on verbal art, and she is an expert in verbal art. So thanks a lot for being here. Yeah, the Reframe COVID initiative, if you look it up on Google, you will find it. So this was launched by a group of linguists working on metaphor. They are trying to find alternative ways of representing the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, metaphorically. So they're trying to find ways of, avoiding war metaphors, which are obviously everywhere, as I'm sure you all know. So yeah, we can all contribute to the Reframe COVID initiative by posting other kinds of metaphors that we find, I don't know, while reading newspapers or online, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so the problem with war metaphors, as I was saying before, is that they are divisive. So a war metaphor, a war metaphor is by its very nature a divisive metaphor, in the sense that there is a conflict involved, there is a bad side and a good side, there will be probably more or less loyal soldiers or more or less brave soldiers. So it's not really the best way of conceptualizing something like a pandemic, and yet war metaphors are typically used, unfortunately, in health issues. So, for instance, I think one of the alternative metaphors that they suggest that could replace the war metaphor is a metaphor based on fire. Fire is something that spreads, that is dangerous, that spreads, very quickly. So it has, some of the connotations it has. They could work. They could actually replace a war metaphor. But the difference, which is a key difference, is that with a metaphor based on fire, there's no conflict involved. And, the opposing forces, the conflict, the opposing sides disappear. The problem is, as you rightly say, it's very, very difficult to get rid of such a widespread conceptualization, metaphorical representation such as war, which is everywhere. War metaphors are really widespread in discourse related to the pandemic nowadays.
Okay.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah.
Any other question? More questions? So we have some of.
Can I meanwhile say hi to Mariangela, who is a colleague working here at LILEC, and so I just noted so she's just posted on the chat. So Dr. Mariangela Picciuolo, nice to see you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for the.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I think we don't have any further questions, so we really appreciate Antonella's availability to be here today and sharing with us about all this hard work. These things actually, they take a lot of time and years and to build up on this. So we are very happy to have you. We are very, very honored to work with the University of Bologna with CeSLiC, and we hope to have more joint events in the future. Thanks to Professor Anna Pan for being here. She's the current leader of the center. Professor Donna Miller also for being here, and even though she's already retired, but she's very active and she's pushing us whenever she needs to, very firmly. And it's always very, very nice to meet you all. For our audience, it's really a pleasure. This is the reason why we do these things. So thank you for coming. So this is the third day already. Tomorrow we have a break tomorrow, so we come back on Friday, same time, 9 o'clock in Rio Branco, 11 o'clock in Brasilia time, and 3 p.m. Italy time. These time zones I have to juggle with many other time zones already, but it's worth it. So I hope the audience you have learned a lot today. You can contact Professor Dr. Antonella Luporini. Here's her email is on the screen now, so you can get in touch with her if you have questions, need papers, and more exchange ideas on corpus linguistics and metaphors. This is definitely something to explore. And on Monday, we have a talk on Friday, and then another one on Monday with Professor Christian Madsen. And we will be exploring, we'll continue with this conversation on language and systems. So it's really a great pleasure. Looking forward to seeing you all again on Friday. Thank you very much, Antonella. Have a wonderful day on your side. Okay, thank you for your availability again.
Thank you for inviting me, Francisco, and congratulations. This event is very inspiring. So thanks a lot, really. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. You're welcome. Okay, and I'll just hold on, guys. I need to thank, so far, we haven't talked about the people behind here. Ed, today we have Ed, Ana Clara, Iolani, sort of on guard here, checking things, and we also have Kayan and Rogério Mendonça. He works with us, one of the lecturers in the Department of English that we have here. So thank you very much, everyone. So I'll see you all on Friday. Okay, have a good day, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye bye.